The rabbi recently recommended changing the Nusach of the Bracha Bonei Yerushalayim in Shmona Esrei and Birkat HaMazon. Some people have asked how this is possible. Wasn't the Nusach of the Shmona Esrei fixed precisely word for word by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah 2,500 years ago?
Yes, it is true that recently I recommended making such a change in the Nusach, in the wording of the Bracha, for the simple and obvious reason that the city of Yerushalayim today is full of people, full of Jews more specifically, and therefore to use the same formulation and to beseech Hashem to rebuild Yerushalayim as it was relevant to do many generations ago is clearly not correct and unreasonable today. And Hazal referred to the concept of Tefillah show, a Tefillah that is gratuitous because it is no longer relevant. In other words, the thing in question has already taken place. That is something we are not allowed to do. This is why I made such a recommendation. And of course I knew at the time that there would be those who would immediately ask, how is it possible to make such a change to the Nusach of the Barachot, whether it be Shmona Esrei or Birkat HaMazon? Because after all, was the Nusach of these Barachot not formulated precisely word for word by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah? That is the question that I have heard on many occasions. And the simple answer to that question is no, that is not the case. There is a wide-held assumption based on certain statements and information in different places that the Chachamim at the time of Ezra Sofer or in the generations immediately following Ezra Sofer, going back 2,400 years or so, laid down precisely the wording of the Barachot that we say, all the Barachot that we say, and particularly Birkot Kriyat Shema, the Barachot that are said together with Kriyat Shema, and the Barachot of the Shmona Esrei, the standing Tefillah, which consists of 18 Barachot, and of Birkat HaMazon. There is a widely held opinion or assumption that these Barachot were precisely formulated word for word all those years ago, and therefore they are immutable. And it is true that from what the Rambam writes in Ilchot Tefillah, it does seem that he presents such a picture. But it must be said that there can be no doubt that this is not the case, that historically there was no such precise word-for-word formulation of these barachot, whether it be Shmona Esrei or Birkat HaMazon or any of the other barachot that we say on a regular basis. And this claim is hardly new. First of all, we should mention here that which the Rashba writes in his Chidushim, in his novella and explanations to Masechet Barachot of the Talmud Bavli 11a. I'll quote just one or two sentences. He writes as follows, with regards to the meaning of a certain Mishnah. He says, Laula memara, this does not mean to say, She'eno rashai lechaser uleha'arich b'nusach ha'baracha. This is not to say that one is not permitted to add words or detract words from the Nusach of the Bracha. This is not so. That's one statement. I'm quoting only a few words from a very long piece that the Rashba writes here. He goes on to say later, Ela wadai, there is no doubt, she'en hakpada beribui hanusach umi'uto. There is no problem, no halachic issue with making the Nusach longer or shorter. Ela b'matbe'a shetov'u bo hachamim. What we are required to be precise about and not change in any way is the matbe'a of the Chachamim. What does that refer to, the matbe'a? And this is apparently the source of much confusion with in the eyes of many people. What is this matbe'a that we refer to? It is not the nusach, it is not the actual words that one says or one does not say. It is not the choice of words, but rather, the Rashba explains, V'hu sheyesh ivrachot shepothachot bevaruch. The matbe'a refers to the general configuration and style and setup of the barachot. In other words, there are barachot, as we know, that begin with Baruch and end with Baruch. Let's take the first bracha of Birkat HaMazon. It begins with Baruch Atah Hashem, and it ends with Baruch Atah Hashem, Mazon et HaKol. The second bracha does not begin with Baruch. It begins immediately with Noda Lecha, but it does end with Baruch also, as we know. This fact that one bracha begins in such a fashion, the other bracha begins in another fashion, this is what is referred to as matbea barachot. And that is what we are not allowed to change, says the Rashba. This is based on the discussion of the Mishnah regarding the brachot, which appears there in Masechet Brachot, Daf Yud Aleph, and the sources can be looked up. They're there for all to see. This is one major important source, and there can be no doubt about the truth of what the Rashba says. And the reason there can be no doubt about this is the simple fact, for example, that we know, and it's already mentioned in the Talmud, that already in ancient times, the time of Hazal, in Eretz Yisrael, they would say, on Shabbat, for example, in the Shmoneh Esrei, they would say, Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbat. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, they would say, Mekadesh Yisrael Uyom HaShabbat. That is another example of a difference between the one Nusach, which was commonly said in Bavel and in Babylon, another that was said in Eretz Yisrael. They were not identical, and yet they both existed side by side. If it were known, and this was accepted by all, that there was one precise Nusach, text of these barachot, of these tefillot, laid down by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, word for word, then there should have been no room for these alternate minharim, customs, and nuschaot. What should they have done? Obviously they should have gone back to the source and check what the nusach was that Anshe Knesset HaGedolah in fact laid down, and then everyone would have to follow that specific and that precise nusach, but this is not the case. The same is true with many issues regarding tefillah. We find in Masechet Eruvin in the Mishnah, we discover a mahloket regarding the tefillah, the nusach of the bracha of tefillah on a Yom Tov. Another obvious example is what we find in the Mishnah, at the beginning of the 8th chapter of Masechet Barachot. In the Talmud Bavli before us, it is Daf Nun Aleph Amud Bet 51b, regarding the bracha that we all say during Havdalah, every Mosai Shabbat or Mosai Yom Tov. According to Beth Shammai, we should be saying Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Ha'olam Shebara Me'or Ha'esh. But Beth Hillel say the bracha is Baruch Atah Hashem, etc. Borei Me'orei Ha'esh, and we all know that we follow the practice of Beth Hillel. Again, the question must be asked: why is there such a discussion between Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel? It is true that this is not a discussion which pertains to a central core belief of Torah Judaism, but yet there is such a discussion regarding the precise nusach of the bracha. Why is this the case? If Anshe Knesset HaGedolah laid down the nusach for all these things very precisely, word for word, and there is no doubt that Havdalah, like Kiddush, is a very ancient takana of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, as is mentioned in Masechet Barachot of the Talmud Bavli Daf Lamed Gimel 33a, then we would not expect to find such a discussion. And if there was a discussion, if there was a difference of opinion, or it was remembered differently by different Chachamim, surely there should have been some text kept somewhere, or it should have been possible to, even if it was only known orally, it should have been possible to clarify what was the more correct nusach. And yet we don't see any such thing. We find that there were those who said one and those who said the other, and no one thought that there was a problem with doing so. All this indicates clearly that there was no precise nusach for these barachot and for these tefillot, word for word, that was immutable. This was not the case. What was clear to all was that when it comes to Havdalah, there is a bracha to be said regarding fire, and the precise nusach was a matter of opinion. But there was no question as to the matbea, the general configuration and content of the Havdalah. On top of all the foregoing, we have the following Gemara, the following statement, in a Braita actually, in the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Barachot, Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph 34a, where we are told as follows: Tnora Banana was taught by our Chachamim as follows: Ma'aseh b'Talmid Ehad. It once happened that a student of Rabbi Eliezer, Yerad Lifnei Teva Bifnei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, the famous Tana, and his students were probably studying Torah, and they also apparently stopped to daven, to pray together. V'haya ma'arich yoter midai, and he was the shliach tzibur, and he said a very long version of the Tefillah. Amaru lo talmido, Rabbeinu kama arkanu zeh. The other students turned to Rabbi Eliezer after the Tefillah and said to him, how very long-winded is that individual. He says such a long version of the Tefillah. They complained. And Rabbi Eliezer said to them, Amalahem kalum ma'arich yoter Moshe Rabbeinu. Was he more lengthy, more wordy than Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu, it says with regards to him in Sefer Devarim, Perek Tet, in the 9th chapter of Sefer Devarim, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu davened eth 40 hayom with 40 halayla, that he davened for 40 days and 40 nights. And certainly in 40 days and 40 nights of Tefillah, one says a great deal more than this Talmud, even if he was very long-winded, could possibly have said in one Shmoneh Esrei. In other words, he told them the way he davened, the wordy version of the Shmoneh Esrei that he used is perfectly okay, perfectly legitimate. You have no grounds for complaint. He goes on to say, Shuv ma'aseh b'talmid echad. It happened on another occasion that the same thing happened. Another student was nominated to be the shliach tzibur, and he said the Shmoneh Esrei, and he was mekaser yoter midai, and he said it very briefly, very concisely. He used very few words. And the other students thought that he was too concise, and they complained to Rabbi Eliezer about this, and he replied, Klum mekaser yoter Moshe Rabbeinu. Was he any more concise than Moshe Rabbeinu, with regards to whom it says when Miriam was struck with sara'ath, with leprosy, Moshe Rabbeinu prayed and said 5 words, El na, Rafa na la. Was he more concise than that? He was not, so you have no reason to complain. This is what we find in Masechet Berachot, Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph. And before I continue, I know that there are those who will say, in order to allow themselves, as it were, not to accept this proof, which is very plain, as I will explain, and which, of course, also simply confirms all the other proofs that we already mentioned. There are those who will say these students were not referring to an individual who said a wordy, long-winded version of the Shmoneh Esrei as opposed to a more concise version. In other words, there was no difference in the text that was being recited. Rather, the difference was in how quickly, how fast or slow the student in question was praying aloud for the tzibur, for the congregation. This interpretation is not correct without any doubt, because the words ma'arich and mekaser do not mean slowly and quickly. If we were to speak about speed, they would have to say shehayam maher, that he was saying it quickly, or if he was saying it slowly, he said it la'at, he said it in terms of time. But that's not at all what's being said here. What Rabbi Eliezer says to them in both cases is that on one occasion Moshe Rabbeinu davened for a very long time, yes, but obviously in that long time he must have said a great deal. And on another occasion Moshe Rabbeinu davened, the same Moshe Rabbeinu davened and said very few words, and his tefillah was effective. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer was teaching them the rule that there is no difference between one version and the other version. In other words, no difference in as much as both are legitimate, both are possible. The fact that there were 2 students of Rabbi Eliezer, one who said a lengthy, wordy version of the Shmoneh Esrei, and the other said a much more concise version of the same Shmoneh Esrei, not only does it not contradict what we just said before, it entirely is in agreement with what we said before. This is exactly what the Rashba said, that with regards to the Nusach, with regards to the wording, there are no hard and fast rules. What we are obliged to maintain and not to change in any way is the matbea, that is to say, the overall structure of the tefillah. So if we have the Shmon Esrei, for example, we have 18 barachot in a certain order, in a specific order which we cannot change. That is part of the matbea of the Chachamim, the overall configuration and structure of the tefillah. And the first bracha begins with Baruch, the subsequent barachot do not begin with Baruch, as we know. These are all issues to do with the matbea. This is what the Rashba said exactly, and there's no question that the two students of Rabbi Eliezer were doing exactly so. They were saying the same Shmon Esrei in terms of the structure, in terms of the general format, in terms of the theme for each bracha, and they were saying the brachot in the same order, but they were expressing themselves either concisely or in a much more wordy and repetitive fashion. So this Gemara, this statement, these two stories regarding Rabbi Eliezer and his Talmidim is proof positive of what the Rashba says, and other Chachamim have also said, that there was no precise Nusach of the Tefillah at any time in history. There was the general takana, the general matbea, but the precise Nusach was always left open for individuals and communities to choose that which they found to be most meaningful, most edifying, and most appropriate. And therefore, seeing that we have a true and legitimate issue with saying a tefillat shal, saying a prayer, which is no longer relevant because Hashem in His mercy has already brought back Am Yisrael in huge numbers to Eretz Yisrael and to Yerushalayim, and the city is rebuilt. Therefore, it is not correct to ask Hashem to build Yerushalayim, because that tefillah was said in such a fashion and referred to a different situation where in fact Yerushalayim was, as I've explained, Yudenrein, without Jewish habitations, without Jews at all. The overall concept of Bonei Yerushalayim, which I do not recommend that we change in any way, that general concept of Bonei Yerushalayim does refer to all aspects of Binyan Yerushalayim, that is to say the physical rebuilding of the city and the repopulation of the city with the Jewish people, with those who belong here, as opposed to those who do not belong here. I've also pointed out in the past that in ancient times also, even the time of the Beit Mikdash, there were many non-Jews who lived in Eretz Yisrael. There were many non-Jews who lived in Yerushalayim. Not that this was proper, not that this is how it should have been, but it was so. And yet, no one referred to this as a situation which required the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. And it does, of course, refer, when we say Bonei Yerushalayim, we also refer to the overall concept of a rebuilt Yerushalayim, which includes a Mikdash, for example. And that's, of course, the pinnacle of the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. But that we refer to in the Nusach that I recommended, when we speak about Hashem showing mercy and allowing us and coming to our aid to rebuild the Mikdash. So we are talking and focusing about that which needs to be said specifically. Baruch Atah Hashem Bonei Yerushalayim refers to the entire process from beginning to end. Baruch Hashem, the beginning and perhaps also the middle of the process is behind us, but there is still much that needs to be done. There is one more point that needs to be mentioned here in conclusion, and that is, for those who claim that there was, at least at one point in time, a precise nusach, word for word, laid down by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, then I would wish to ask these people the following question. Which of the nuschaot that we see before us today, nusach of the Teimanim, nusach of the Sephardim, nusach of the Ashkenazim, nusach Ashkenaz, nusach Sepharad, etc., all the different nuschaot that we have, which of those nuschaot is the one that was laid down by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah? Because if a person makes this claim and furthermore claims that we cannot in any way deviate from that specific nusach that once existed, then we must reach the conclusion that at most one of these nuschaot, perhaps none of them, but at least one, but no more than one, is the precise one that was laid down 2,500 years ago, and all the others are spurious, or at least not exactly as they should be. This is an incorrect understanding, a misconceived understanding of the whole topic, and it is therefore better to lay to rest such misconceptions and to understand the true nature and the true structure of the tefillah.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.